With a final motion, the federal delegate drew a pair of handcuffs from the inside pocket of his jacket and, with the coldness of one fulfilling his duty, cuffed the corrupt officer, who now trembled, humiliated and unmasked. The law, not the uniform, had spoken loudest. The law, not the uniform, had spoken loudest. The metallic click of the handcuffs, a dry echo in the now silent room, seemed to seal not just the fate of one man, but the end of an era of impunity. The corrupt officer, once so imposing in his arrogance, was now merely a trembling body, bowed under the weight of his own shame and the cold steel on his wrists. His eyes, once full of contempt, fixed on the federal delegate with a mixture of disbelief and terror. The mask of authority had fallen, revealing the fragility of a man caught in his own web. For the federal delegate, the moment was bittersweet. The satisfaction of seeing justice served was profound, but it came with the bitter memory of the humiliation that preceded it. Every word of scorn, every look of disdain the officer had cast, now turned back on him, amplified by the irony of the situation. It was not a matter of personal revenge, but of an unwavering principle. The law is equal for all, and the uniform does not grant immunity from corruption. The cell phone, still in the delegate's hands, displayed the irrefutable proof. The bribery video, with its brutal clarity, continued to loop, a silent testament to the betrayal of public trust. The screen's light illuminated the pale face of the cuffed officer, exposing every line of deepening despair on his skin. He tried to speak, a guttural murmur that found no voice, only a choke of panic. The federal delegate, however, gave him no room for negotiation or pleas. The time for dialogue was over. With a deliberate movement, the federal delegate picked up the landline phone from the desk. His fingers dialed the numbers with mechanical precision, the calm in his voice contrasting sharply with the internal chaos of the man before him. "Agent Silva, please. Federal Delegate Almeida. I need 2 teams of agents in my office immediately. We have a detainee and an in flagrante situation for passive corruption and malfeasance. And please notify Internal Affairs. This is a high-priority case." With each word, reality solidified for the cuffed officer. It was not a bluff, not an empty threat. It was the justice system, slow and relentless, beginning to turn. The federal delegate hung up the phone, his gaze fixed on the man. "You will have all legal guarantees, officer, but from now on, your silence is your best defense. Anything you say can and will be used against you." The room, once a stage for humiliation, was now the scene of a downfall. The smell of bitter coffee and old paper seemed more intense, mixing with the cold sweat of fear. The federal delegate leaned back in the chair, the same chair the officer had mocked, and observed the detainee. His mind was already processing the next steps, formalizing the arrest, collecting statements, analyzing additional evidence. That video was just the tip of the iceberg, and experience told him that corruption rarely operates in isolation. He thought of the network of complicity that might be behind that single officer. How many others were involved? How many lives had been affected by their actions? The sense of duty intensified. That incident, though personally outrageous, was a reminder of the greater work that awaited him. The integrity of the institution was at stake, and it was his role as federal delegate to protect it. The sound of hurried footsteps in the corridor broke the tense silence, announcing the arrival of the teams. The door opened, revealing 2 uniformed agents, their faces displaying a mixture of surprise and professionalism upon seeing the scene. They didn't need detailed explanations. The image of the cuffed officer in the federal delegate's office spoke for itself. Justice that day had arrived unexpectedly, clothed in the dignity of one who had been underestimated. And for the federal delegate, it was just the beginning. The air in the room, already dense with tension, seemed to vibrate with the agent's arrival. Their firm footsteps in the corridor had been a prelude, but the image that unfolded before them as the door opened was a shock The federal delegate, previously an ordinary man they had seen enter, was now seated in his own chair, posture erect and gaze unwavering. And before him, cuffed, was a colleague, a military police officer, visibly broken. The surprise on their faces was palpable, a mixture of disbelief and the military discipline that prevented them from openly questioning the scene. "Delegate Almeida," one of them began, his voice a tone lower than usual. "Agents Silva and team at your disposal." The federal delegate, with a calm gesture, indicated the cuffed officer. "Agent Silva, please escort the detainee to the custody room. He will be formally charged with passive corruption and malfeasance. The evidence is on this cell phone." He held up the device, the screen still displaying the video on loop, a mute and irrefutable testimony. "Ensure all legal guarantees are observed, but also that there is no attempt at external communication. This case is sensitive and has broader implications." The delegate's voice was cold and professional, devoid of any trace of the humiliation he had endured minutes earlier. It was the voice of the law, speaking through him. The agents, quickly recovering from the initial shock, moved with efficiency. The corrupt officer, once so arrogant, was now an inert burden. He tried to resist, a weak shrug of his shoulders, a murmured protest that was lost in his throat. But the agent's authority was unquestionable. They lifted him, one on each side, and escorted him out of the room. With each step, the cuffed officer seemed to shrink. His eyes, once full of scorn, were now pools of despair, fixed on the federal delegate, perhaps seeking one last chance, a glimmer of clemency that would not come. But the delegate merely watched, his expression impassive. There was no personal satisfaction in his gaze, only the gravity of duty fulfilled and the awareness of what was yet to come. The shuffling sound of his shoes on the carpet, the dry click of the handcuffs with each movement, were the only sounds as he was led away. The door closed behind them, sealing the fate of one man and opening a new chapter for the investigation. The silence that followed in the room was almost deafening, broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioning. The federal delegate leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for an instant. The adrenaline began to subside, leaving behind a trail of exhaustion and a bitter-sweet feeling. Justice had been served, yes, but the wound of humiliation still stung, a vivid reminder of the fragility of human dignity in the face of abuse of power. He opened his eyes, his gaze sweeping the room. The desk was still a little messy, papers scattered, the coffee cup almost empty. Small details that now seemed to carry the weight of the entire confrontation. The cell phone, still in his hand, was the irrefutable proof, the pivot of the entire turnaround. He placed it carefully on the desk, next to the landline phone. The delegate's mind was already in full swing, charting the next steps. The arrest of that officer was just the tip of the iceberg, as he had suspected. Corruption was rarely an isolated act. There was a network, a web of complicity that needed to be unraveled. How many others were involved? How many lives had been affected by that man's actions and those of his possible accomplices? He picked up the phone again, dialing another number. "Internal Affairs? Federal Delegate Almeida. The case I just reported?" "Yes, the in flagrante. I need a forensic support team here in my office immediately. And I would also like to request access to incident and patrol records for the area over the past 6 months, focusing on reports of extortion or abuse of authority involving military police. This is a priority case, and I believe we are only just beginning to uncover the extent of the problem." The delegate's voice was firm, his determination unwavering. That incident, which began as a personal humiliation, had transformed into a mission. It was no longer about him, the underestimated man. It was about the integrity of the institution, about public trust, about the promise of justice that the uniform should represent. That corrupt officer had dishonored the uniform, and it was the federal delegate's duty to restore that honor, one link at a time. The battle was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun, and he was ready for it. The silence that followed in the room after the cuffed officer's departure was not one of peace, but of a prelude. Federal Delegate Almeida felt the echo of fury and humiliation, a bitter remnant that refused to dissipate. But there was no time to dwell on the past. That incident, though personally outrageous, was now the catalyst for something much larger. His eyes, previously fixed on the door through which the corrupt man had been led, swept the room. The messy desk, the scattered papers, the almost empty coffee cup. Every detail now seemed a reminder of the battle fought and the war that was looming. The call to internal affairs and the forensic team was promptly answered. Minutes later, the corridor once again echoed with footsteps, but this time they were different steps, more organized, more professional. The door opened again, revealing not only uniformed agents, but also technicians with briefcases and specialized equipment. The air in the room, previously dense with the tension of the confrontation, now gained a new layer of seriousness, of purpose. "Delegate Almeida," a firm female voice was heard. It was Agent Laura from the forensic team, known for her meticulousness and for not being fazed by unusual situations. "We are at your disposal." Almeida nodded, indicating the desk. "Agent Laura, I need you to conduct a complete sweep of this room. Any trace, any fingerprint that isn't mine or those of the agents who just left. And most importantly, the cell phone." He pointed to the device on the desk, the screen still displaying the video on loop, a mute and irrefutable testimony of betrayal. "It is the central piece. I need a forensic copy, and for it to be sealed as primary evidence. Urgently, please." As the forensic team began its silent and precise work, with gloves and brushes, Almeida stood up, walking to the window. The city view below seemed indifferent to the small revolution that had just occurred in his office. But he knew that the shockwave would spread. The arrest of a corrupt officer, especially one who had acted with such arrogance, was a signal to the honest that justice existed, and a warning to the dishonest that their days might be numbered. The delegate's mind was working at high speed. That video, the irrefutable proof, was just the starting point. Corruption, like cancer, rarely manifested as a single tumor. There were metastases, a network of complicity that needed to be unraveled. The request for incident and patrol records from the past 6 months was not random. He sought patterns, recurring names, areas with peaks of extortion reports or abuse of authority. Every filed complaint, every silenced murmur could be a link in the chain. "Agent Laura," he called without turning from the window, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "While you work here, I'll start analyzing the data I requested from Internal Affairs. We need to cross-reference information. There's something bigger here, I feel. This officer wasn't acting alone." Agent Laura, without interrupting her meticulous work of collecting evidence, replied, "Understood, Delegate. We'll do our best to ensure the integrity of the evidence and speed in the analysis." Almeida returned to the desk, sitting again in the chair that minutes earlier had been the stage of his humiliation, and then his affirmation. The weight of responsibility was immense. Exposing a network of corruption within the police itself was a dangerous job, requiring not only intelligence and persistence, but also unwavering courage. He knew he would face resistance, perhaps even threats. The corrupt would not relinquish their privileges easily. They would fight. But the image of the cuffed officer, his eyes full of despair, was still vivid in his mind. And more than that, the memory of the contempt, the scorn, the way his dignity had been trampled. It was not revenge, but a deep conviction that the law should prevail. The uniform, a symbol of protection and order, could not be stained by greed and abuse. The integrity of the institution was at stake, and he was its guardian. He opened his laptop, connecting to Internal Affairs' secure network. The first files began to load: patrol reports, call logs, victim statements, a mountain of data that needed to be sifted, analyzed, connected. Every line, every word could be a clue, a link in the chain he intended to break. The silence in the room was broken only by the soft click of the keyboard and the discreet sounds of the forensic team working. The tension, previously concentrated in a direct confrontation, now spread, transforming into a grim anticipation. The hunt had begun, and Federal Delegate Almeida, the man who had been underestimated, was determined not to stop until every piece of the puzzle was found, and the truth, however painful, came to light. He knew the path would be long and arduous, but the flame of justice, ignited by personal humiliation, now burned with the force of an uncontrollable fire, ready to consume the shadows of corruption. This was not just a case, it was a crusade, and he was ready to lead it. The soft click of Federal Delegate Almeida's keyboard echoed in the silent room, a counterpoint to the discreet and almost surgical movements of the forensic team. His fingers danced over the keys, navigating a mountain of data that unfolded on his laptop screen. Patrol reports, call logs, victim statements, internal memos. Each file was a fragment, a piece in a puzzle he was determined to assemble. Internal Affairs had granted access, and now the responsibility of sifting through this information fell to him. Almeida began with the records from the past 6 months, as he had requested. He filtered by extortion reports, abuse of authority, improper conduct. The initial result was a daunting volume. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of incidents, many of them filed without resolution or classified as insufficient evidence. Frustration began to bubble, but he contained it. He knew that corruption fed on bureaucracy and the disbelief of victims. He refined the search, cross-referencing the data with specific geographical areas, especially those with a higher incidence of small businesses and more vulnerable communities, where police extortion often thrived. A pattern began to emerge, subtle at first, but increasingly clear. There were peaks of complaints in certain neighborhoods, always involving the same type of grievance. Merchants forced to pay protection fees, drivers stopped without cause and coerced, residents threatened with false accusations. His eyes fixed on a name that appeared with alarming frequency in several of these incidents, often as the officer who responded, or who was mentioned by victims before their complaints were mysteriously withdrawn or filed. It was the name of the officer he had just cuffed. The corrupt officer, whose scorn still echoed in his memory, was, in fact, the tip of a much larger iceberg. Delegate Almeida, Agent Laura's voice broke his concentration, but didn't startle him. He looked up from his laptop. "We managed to make a forensic copy of the cell phone. It's robust evidence. In addition to the bribery video, there are call logs and messages we're starting to analyze, and we found something else." Laura approached the desk, holding a sealed envelope. There was a hidden memory card, well disguised. It contains a series of photos and videos of other meetings with different people in different locations. It seems to be a personal file of trophies, or more likely, a blackmail record. Some of the faces in the images are recognizable. They're not just civilians. There are other officers. A shiver ran down Almeida's spine. Other officers. What rank? Which department? We're still identifying everyone, but some appear to be from the military police, yes, and there are 1 or 2 who might be from other forces or even local political figures. It's explosive material, Delegate. Almeida nodded slowly, his heart beating faster. That confirmed his worst suspicions. It wasn't just a lone wolf, it was a pack. The web of corruption was vaster and deeper than he had imagined. The cell phone, which minutes earlier was proof of a single crime, now revealed itself to be a Pandora's box. He returned to the laptop, his fingers flying with renewed urgency. He began to cross-reference the names of the officers Laura had mentioned with the incident records he was already analyzing. And then the connection became undeniable. The names of the officers in the memory card photos appeared in the patrol reports for the areas with the highest incidence of filed complaints. They were the guardians of certain territories, the facilitators of extortion, those who ensured that complaints did not progress. "Agent Laura," he called, his voice grave, "I need a priority analysis of these faces. Identify each one of them and prepare a detailed report on the cell phone's communications. I want to know who he spoke with, how often, and the content of the messages. This is urgent." "Understood, Delegate," Laura replied, already moving away to instruct her team. The seriousness in her voice indicated that she understood the magnitude of the discovery. Almeida leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a brief instant. Adrenaline pulsed through his veins, no longer from humiliation, but from the imminence of a battle. He had stumbled upon something much larger than a simple case of passive corruption. He was facing an organized network, a system that fed on impunity and fear. That arrogant officer, by trying to humiliate him, had inadvertently handed over the keys to a dark realm. The image of the faces in the photos, the growing list of names on his screen, the feeling that each step led him deeper into a dangerous swamp, all of this mixed with the unwavering determination that now guided him. He knew that exposing this network would be a Herculean challenge, one that would put his career and perhaps his life at risk. The tentacles of corruption were long and powerful, and they would not surrender without a fight. But the flame of justice, ignited by personal humiliation and now fueled by the discovery of the problem's extent, burned stronger than ever. It was no longer about him, the underestimated man. It was about the integrity of the institution, about ruined lives, about the promise of justice that the uniform should represent. This was not just a case, it was a crusade, and Federal Delegate Almeida, the man who had been trampled, was ready to lead it, no matter the cost. The hunt had only just begun, and he would not rest until every link in that chain was broken, and the truth, however painful, came to light. Hours dragged on, turning into a tense vigil. Agent Laura returned, her eyes tired, but with a determination that mirrored Almeida's. "Delegate." The team managed to identify the first names. They are 3 military police officers of various ranks, a sergeant and 2 corporals, all assigned to battalions covering the areas with the highest incidence of complaints you pointed out. And most concerning, one of them is an aide to an influential city councilman. The news hit Almeida like a punch to the gut, but it didn't surprise him. Political infiltration was a natural step for a corruption network seeking protection and impunity. "And the communications?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "The arrested officer's cell phone is a true treasure trove. There are encrypted messages, but we're managing to decipher them. They reveal a hierarchy, Delegate. It's not a horizontal network. There's a command, someone who orchestrates the actions and distributes the profits. The messages are coded, but the frequency and content suggest orders and reports of successful missions. And there are mentions of regular payments, commissions that are passed on to the boss. The boss. Almeida repeated, the word hanging in the air like a shadow. The dimension of the problem expanded with each new discovery. It wasn't just a matter of arresting a few corrupt officers. It was about dismantling a criminal structure that extended beyond the streets, reaching offices and perhaps even higher spheres. He stood up, walking to the window again. The city, previously indifferent, now seemed like a chessboard, where every piece he moved could trigger a chain reaction. "Laura, we need absolute discretion. No one outside this room can know the extent of what we've found. If the boss knows we're close, he'll make a move, and the consequences could be disastrous." The agent nodded, seriousness etched on her face. Understood, delegate. The forensic team is already under total secrecy. All information is being treated as top secret. Almeida turned to her, his eyes fixed and intense. We need a plan. We can't just go around arresting people. That would only alert the others. We need to map out the entire network, identify the boss and all his tentacles before we act. It's a game of patience, but with the urgency of someone who knows time is running out. He opened a digital map of the city on his laptop, overlaying the complaint areas, the patrol locations of the identified officers, and the addresses of those involved. The web began to take shape, a tangle of lines crossing at strategic points. The battle had barely begun, but Almeida felt he was on the right track. The initial humiliation had been the spark, but the flame now burned with the force of an unwavering conviction. He was ready for war. The night wore on, but for Federal Delegate Almeida, time had dissolved into a spiral of data and discoveries. Fatigue was a dense fog in his eyes, but adrenaline, fueled by the imminence of truth, kept him awake. He leaned over the digital map, the colored lines intertwining like veins of a diseased organism. Every point, every connection was a fragment of that web of corruption that extended far beyond what he could have imagined. The boss. The word echoed in his mind, a grim enigma. The messages deciphered by Laura's team were like whispers in the dark, revealing the existence of a mastermind behind the entire operation. The regular payments, the commissions, the successful missions, everything indicated a coldly calculated hierarchical structure, where each piece had its role and its price. Agent Laura, with her team, continued to delve into the digital depths of the seized cell phone, unraveling layer after layer of encryption. Each new message, each call log, was a step forward, but also a reminder of the enemy's complexity. Almeida knew that patience was crucial, but urgency was a constant weight. Every hour that passed was another hour in which the boss could be acting, consolidating his power, or worse, realizing that his tentacles were being investigated. Discretion was the only weapon they had at that moment. No one, absolutely no one outside that room, could know the true extent of what they had discovered. The leak of a single piece of information could dismantle all their work, putting lives at risk. He slid his finger across the laptop screen, zooming in on a specific area of the map. It was a lower middle-class neighborhood with a high concentration of small businesses. Extortion reports there were endemic, but always filed away. Now, with the names of the identified officers in the cell phone photos and cross-referenced patrol records, the picture was clear. That was one of the controlled territories. The corrupt officers didn't act randomly. They had designated areas, almost like fiefdoms, where they operated with impunity. "Delegate," Laura's voice was low, but carried a new gravity. She approached, extending a tablet. "We managed to decipher a few more messages. They refer to a weekly meeting at a specific location, a bar downtown known to be frequented by politicians and businessmen." Almeida took the tablet, his eyes fixed on the screen. The date and time of the next meeting were there, cold and precise. It was in 2 days. That was an opportunity, but also an immense risk. Would the boss be there? Or would it just be one of his lieutenants collecting the week's profits? "They use a code to refer to the payments," Laura continued, pointing to a line of text. "The week's harvest, and the amount is always high, Delegate. Very high. This isn't just about small business owners. There's something bigger at play." Almeida's intuition screamed. That volume of money couldn't just come from extorting small businesses. There was something more, something that justified the network's complexity, the political protection, the infiltration into different forces, money laundering, trafficking, smuggling. The possibilities were terrifying. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for an instant, trying to visualize the scene at the bar. Who would be there? How would they communicate? How could he obtain evidence without alerting them? The idea of direct action was tempting but imprudent. Arresting one or two links wouldn't break the chain. It would only make it retract and strengthen in secret. "Laura, we need more information about this bar," Almeida said, opening his eyes. His voice was calm, but his determination was palpable. "Who is the owner? Who are the usual patrons? Are there security cameras? We need a complete survey without raising suspicions." "I'm already on it," she replied, already moving towards her workstation. The synergy between them was almost telepathic. Almeida returned to the map, but now his mind was elsewhere. He needed a plan that would not only identify the boss, but dismantle the entire structure at once. A surgical, silent operation that would cut off the tentacles and strike at the heart of the network before it could react. He thought of the humiliation he had suffered, the arrogance of the corrupt officer, and a cold fire ignited in his chest. It was no longer just about justice. It was about honor, about the integrity of his uniform, about the promise of a country where the law was not a commodity. The hunt had transformed into a war of intelligence, and he was ready for every move, every counterattack. The silence of the room was broken only by the soft click of Laura's keyboard and the almost imperceptible hum of Almeida's laptop. Outside, the city slept, oblivious to the battle being fought in its underground. But Almeida knew that soon the truth would come to light. And when it did, the tremor would be felt by all. He would not rest until the light of justice penetrated every corner of that dark realm. The war was only just beginning, and he was determined to win it. The following hours stretched into an investigative marathon. Laura, with almost supernatural efficiency, compiled a detailed dossier on the bar. Its name was The Meeting Point, a bitter irony considering its true purpose. The owner, a front businessman named Ricardo Mendez, had obscure ties to the already identified councilman and to lesser-known, but equally influential figures of the underworld. The bar's security cameras were a critical point. "There are 4 internal cameras, Delegate," Laura informed, pointing to a diagram on the tablet. 2 cover the main hall, 1 the bar, and another the entrance. But there's a blind spot in the back, near the restrooms, and a small storage room. Almeida analyzed the diagram, his eyes scanning every detail. The blind spot was an opportunity, but also a risk. It was likely that the most sensitive meetings would occur there, or that money exchanges would be made in a discreet location. "And the usual patrons?" he asked. "An interesting mix," Laura replied, sliding to a list of names and photos. "Small business owners, some lawyers, lobbyists, and of course low and mid-level politicians. It's a nest of contacts, Delegate. A place where informal business is done all the time." The list confirmed Almeida's suspicions. The network wasn't just about extortion, but about influence, money laundering, and perhaps even the control of larger illicit activities. The regular payments could be the tip of the iceberg of a much more complex and lucrative scheme. Almeida stood up, walking to the digital map again. The meeting point pulsed red in the center of the web. "We can't afford a direct approach," he mused aloud. "If the boss is there, or if his lieutenants are alerted, they'll disappear into the shadows. We need eyes and ears inside without anyone noticing." The idea of infiltration was dangerous, but seemed the only way to obtain concrete evidence and identify the highest links in the chain. "Laura, do you have someone on the team you trust blindly for a discreet surveillance operation? Someone who can blend in, observe, and, if possible, record without being noticed?" Laura hesitated for a moment, her eyes narrowing in concentration. "I have an agent, Delegate, Pedro. He's new to the team, but has an impeccable record in intelligence operations. He's discreet, observant, and has a photographic memory, and most importantly, no one here knows him well enough to associate him with us, which minimizes the risk of a leak. Almeida nodded. A new face with no obvious connections was exactly what they needed. Prepare him. He'll need solid cover, a backstory that withstands any scrutiny, and state-of-the-art surveillance equipment, hidden and discreet. Microphones, high-definition cameras. We want every word, every movement. The tension in the room increased. The clock on the wall seemed to tick faster, each tick a countdown to the meeting. Almeida felt the weight of responsibility, but also a renewed clarity. The initial humiliation had been a catalyst, but now it was the conviction to dismantle that rot that propelled him. He wasn't just hunting criminals. He was restoring faith in an institution that had been stained. Pedro will have to be a shadow, Almeida instructed Laura. He must not intervene, must not be noticed. His mission is to collect information, nothing more. His safety is paramount. If there's any sign of danger, he aborts. It's not worth risking a life for a piece of evidence. Laura took notes, the seriousness on her face mirroring the delegates. Understood, delegate. I'll prepare the briefing and the equipment. He'll be ready. Almeida looked back at the map, at the red dot of the meeting point. The chess game was about to enter its most critical phase. He had moved his first pieces, and now it was the enemy's turn to reveal a little more of their strategy. Patience was a virtue, but action was imminent. He would not rest until the light of justice penetrated every corner of that dark realm. The war was only just beginning, and he was determined to win it, no matter the cost. Hours dragged on, but the energy in the operations room was palpable, almost electric. Every move Laura made was precise, every click on the keyboard a step forward in Pedro's preparation. The agent, a man of medium height and astute gaze, listened attentively to Almeida's instructions, absorbing every detail of the plan that could dismantle a network of corruption as intricate as it was dangerous. Almeida observed Pedro, evaluating him. The agent was the key to the next phase, a fragile but essential link in the investigative chain. Pedro, Almeida's voice was grave but calm. Your mission is to be invisible. You don't exist. You're just another face in the crowd, a silent observer. Any mistake, any slip could cost not only the operation, but your life. Laura projected a series of photos of the meeting point onto the big screen. Your cover will be that of a small real estate investor, newly arrived in the city, looking for opportunities. You have an online profile already created, with a history of modest transactions in other cities. Your name is Marcelo Costa. Memorize every detail, every date, every value. Your story needs to be impeccable. Pedro nodded, his eyes fixed on the images. He was already immersed in the character, his posture subtly adjusting, the expression on his face becoming more neutral, more generic. He was a chameleon, and this was his new skin. The equipment, Laura continued, pointing to an open briefcase on the desk. Inside, a collection of tiny, almost imperceptible devices. A high-definition microcamera camouflaged in your shirt button, a lapel microphone with directional range integrated into the lining of your jacket, and a backup audio recorder in your watch. Everything encrypted, with real-time transmission to our central hub. Any anomaly, any interruption in the signal, and we will consider you to be in danger. Almeida approached, his shadow covering the map on the big screen. We don't want heroes, Pedro. We want information. If the situation gets tense, if you feel you've been discovered or that your life is at risk, abort immediately. Your safety is the priority. No evidence is worth a life. The seriousness in the delegate's words was a weight that hung in the air. Pedro understood the gravity of the situation. He wasn't just an agent. He was a pawn in a high-stakes chess game where every move was calculated and the consequences irreversible. While Laura reviewed the technical details with Pedro, Almeida stepped away, his mind working on multiple fronts. He visualized the bar, the tables, the faces. Who would be there? Would the boss reveal himself? Or would he send an emissary, a lieutenant, to collect the week's harvest? Almeida's intuition screamed that the weekly meeting was more than a simple money exchange. It was a ritual, a demonstration of power, a moment to consolidate alliances and plan the next steps. The humiliation he had suffered, the arrogance of the corrupt officer, all of it had transformed into a cold, constant fuel. It wasn't revenge, but an unwavering determination to expose the rot that corroded institutions. The uniform he wore, the trust society placed in him, demanded that he be relentless. The meeting point was more than a bar. It was a knot in the web, a convergence point where the tentacles of corruption united. Pedro's infiltration was the first step to untie that knot, to map the hierarchy, to identify the true architects of that criminal empire. Laura approached Almeida, a tablet in hand. "Delegate, I've prepared an escape and contingency plan for Pedro. Alternative routes, safe meeting points, and a support team on standby, ready to intervene if necessary. They'll be within a 5-block radius of the bar, disguised, awaiting my signal." Almeida nodded, his mind already processing the scenarios. Pedro's safety was paramount, but the success of the mission depended on his ability to remain unnoticed. "They cannot be identified as our team. Any suspicious movement could compromise everything. Maximum discretion." The next 2 days would be an eternity of waiting. The tension increased with each hour, each minute. Laura's team continued to monitor intercepted communications, looking for any sign of a change in plans, any indication that the network might have been alerted. But the silence was deafening, a sign that for now they were still in the dark, confident in their impunity. Almeida returned to the digital map, zooming in on the image of the meeting point. The red dot pulsed, a beacon of danger and opportunity. He knew he was about to play his riskiest card. The intelligence war was at its peak, and he was ready to face the enemy, one move at a time, until the light of justice penetrated every corner of that dark realm. He would not rest until the truth came to light, and when it did, the tremor would be felt by all. The 2 days that followed were indeed an eternity. For Almeida, every minute was a reminder of the rot he intended to eradicate, a countdown to the moment when Pedro, his most discreet agent, would become the shadow that would penetrate the heart of that web. The operations room, once a cauldron of activity, now reverberated with a tense silence, broken only by the hum of computers and Laura's occasional whisper, reviewing the final details with Pedro. Pedro, or Marcelo Costa, as he now called himself, was a blank canvas, a man with no apparent history, but with a sharp purpose. He had memorized every detail of his new identity, every fictitious real estate transaction, every nuance of his newcomer accent. His mind was a living archive, ready to be accessed under any pressure. On the night of the operation, he looked at himself in the mirror, the well-cut suit, the discreet watch, the shirt button that housed a tiny lens. Everything contributed to the illusion of an ordinary investor. But behind his calm eyes, adrenaline already coursed, an underground river of anticipation. Almeida watched Pedro's departure on the security monitor, a black and white image of the agent getting into a taxi. That taxi, a common model, was the first step of a dangerous journey. The delegate felt the weight of responsibility, Pedro's life in his hands. He had sent a man into the wolf's den, and the only thing he could do now was wait and monitor. The meeting point pulsed with amber light and soft music when Pedro arrived. From the outside, it looked like just another elegant bar with expensive cars parked on the street and a steady flow of well-dressed people. But Pedro knew that beneath that facade of normalcy lay a cesspool. He took a deep breath, adjusted his jacket and entered, settling into the role of Marcelo Costa. The interior was exactly as Laura had described. A main hall with dark wooden tables and leather upholstery, a gleaming bar, and in the back the darker area, near the restrooms and the small storage room, the blind spot. The air was heavy with the smell of whiskey, cigar smoke, and an almost imperceptible tension. Small groups conversed in low voices, forced laughter echoed, and furtive glances were exchanged. It was a stage where hypocrisy was the prevailing currency. Pedro headed to the bar, ordering a whiskey. His eyes, trained to observe without being noticed, swept the environment. He identified the 4 internal cameras, exactly where Laura had indicated. His movements were calculated, his posture relaxed, but his mind was on high alert. He was a ghost, absorbing every detail, every face, every whisper. In the operations center, Almeida and Laura were glued to the monitors. The image from Pedro's microcamera was sharp, the audio crystal clear. They saw what Pedro saw, heard what Pedro heard. Almeida's breath caught in his throat as he watched the agent blend in, a perfect chameleon. "He's at the bar, delegate," Laura murmured, pointing to the screen. "Looks like he's settling in." Almeida nodded, his eyes fixed on the image. He could feel the bar's atmosphere through the screen, the density of that place where power and corruption intertwined. Pedro ordered a second drink, pretending to be absorbed in his cell phone, but in reality discreetly activating the audio recorder on his watch and confirming the microcamera's transmission. He noticed a group of men at a more secluded table near the blind spot. One of them, a corpulent man with a flashy gold ring, seemed to be the center of attention. It was Ricardo Mendez, the bar's front owner and one of the key figures in the investigation. The conversation at Ricardo's table was low, but the fragments Pedro managed to catch, mixed with the bar's murmur, were already revealing. "The week's harvest, all in order. The councilman is satisfied." Pedro felt a shiver. The week's harvest was the code for the regular payments, the concrete evidence they needed. He needed to get closer, but without raising suspicion. Suddenly, a man in a grey suit with a forced smile and suspicious eyes approached Pedro. "First time here, friend?" he asked, his voice laden with false cordiality. Pedro turned with a practiced smile. "Yes, I'm Marcelo Costa. I just arrived in the city, looking for some investment opportunities. This place was recommended to me." The man, whom Pedro recognized from one of Laura's photos as one of the network's minor lobbyists, assessed him from head to toe. "Opportunities, huh? This is the right place, Marcelo, but you need to know who to talk to." He extended his hand. "I'm Carlos. If you need any guidance, you can look me up." Pedro shook Carlos's hand, feeling the pressure of the grip. A subtle test. "I appreciate the tip, Carlos. I'll certainly do that." Carlos smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and walked away, returning to his table, but casting occasional glances at Pedro. The cover had been tested and seemed to have held up, but Pedro knew it was only the beginning. On the monitor, Almeida saw the interaction. "He did well," he murmured, a thread of relief in his voice. "Carlos is one of the watchdogs. If Pedro convinced him, that's a good sign." Laura nodded. "But that means he's being watched. The tension will increase now." They weren't wrong. The movement at Ricardo Mendez's table began to change. One of the men stood up, walking towards the blind spot near the restrooms. Another followed him, carrying a small briefcase. It was the signal. The ritual was about to begin. Pedro felt his heart race. He needed to act. Discreetly, he got up from the bar, pretending to go to the restroom. His path would lead him directly to the blind spot, to the heart of the operation. Every step was calculated, every movement a dance with danger. He was seconds away from witnessing the evidence that could dismantle an entire empire. The light of justice was about to penetrate the darkness, but the risk was immense. He didn't know what awaited him in those few meters. Every step Pedro took towards the back of the bar was a calculation, a held breath, a silent ticking of a clock he couldn't see but could feel. The smell of whiskey and cigar smoke now mingled with the sweet scent of cheap disinfectant coming from the restrooms, a cruel irony for the moral cesspool unfolding there. He was seconds away from witnessing the evidence that could dismantle an entire empire, but the risk was immense. He didn't know what awaited him in those few meters. In the operations center, Almeida and Laura were motionless, their eyes fixed on the monitors. The image from Pedro's micro camera swayed slightly, transmitting the agent's perspective as he moved. The audio captured the bar's murmur, but also Pedro's footsteps, his breathing, and the muffled sound of conversations intensifying as he approached the blind spot. "He's almost there," Laura whispered, her voice tense. The two men with the briefcase have entered the storage area. Ricardo Mendez is at the door, blocking the view from the main table. Almeida nodded, his jaw clenched. This was the moment. The blind spot, a small area between the restrooms and a service door, was where the internal cameras couldn't reach. It was the perfect location for an illicit transaction, but also the most dangerous for an infiltrator. Pedro, using the excuse of going to the restroom, entered the narrow corridor. The light was dimmer there, the shadows longer. He could hear muffled voices coming from the half-open storage room door. Ricardo Mendez, the front owner, stood with his back to him, talking to another man, a corpulent security guard. Ricardo's presence was a barrier, but also a distraction. Pedro walked past them, pretending not to hear, and entered the restroom. The storage room door was a few meters away. He activated the video recording on his micro camera and the audio recorder on his watch, ensuring everything was active. In the fogged mirror, he saw his own reflection, his eyes alert, the mask of Marcelo Costa intact. He washed his hands, took a deep breath, and exited. As he exited, he accidentally bumped slightly into Ricardo Mendez. "Excuse me," Pedro murmured with an apologetic smile. Ricardo looked him up and down, a glint of suspicion in his eyes. "Watch where you're going, friend. This isn't a place for the inattentive." "My apologies again," Pedro replied, maintaining his smile. "I think I had a bit too much to drink. I need some air." He walked away, but not before his micro-camera had caught a glimpse of the small storage room. What he saw and heard in the following seconds were crucial. Inside the room, two men stood over an improvised table. One of them opened the briefcase, revealing stacks of $100 bills. The other, an individual in a dark suit, whom Pedro recognized as one of the councilman's aides, was counting the money with startling agility. 15,000 as agreed, the aide said, his voice low but clear enough for Pedro's microphone. The harvest was good this week. The boss sent word that he's satisfied and that the South Zone project should be expedited. The man who opened the briefcase, one of Ricardo's lieutenants, nodded. "Understood. The message will be delivered and the bonus for the team." The aide smiled, a cold smile. "There's always a bonus for those who are loyal, but loyalty is tested. Remember that." Pedro continued to walk away, pretending to look for an exit to the outdoor area, but every fiber of his being was recording those details. The amount, the code harvest, the mention of the boss, and the South Zone project, everything fit perfectly with the intelligence Almeida had collected. In the operations center, Almeida and Laura exchanged glances. "We got them," Laura whispered, a mix of relief and tension in her voice. "The audio is crystal clear. The image, even if brief, confirms the briefcase and the money. It's the proof we needed." But Pedro's mission wasn't over. He needed to get out of there without raising further suspicion. As he headed back to the bar, Carlos's voice, the lobbyist who had approached him earlier, sounded beside him. "Found the air you needed, Marcelo?" Carlos asked, his eyes narrowed, assessing. "You look a bit pale." Pedro forced a smile. "I think the whiskey didn't agree with me. I'm thinking of leaving. It's been a long night." Carlos nodded but didn't move away. "That's a shame. You just got here and you're already leaving. I thought we could talk about those investment opportunities you mentioned." There was a veiled threat in his words, a suggestion that Pedro should behave himself. Pedro felt a chill. He had been seen too close to the blind spot, and Carlos was an astute watchdog. "Perhaps another time, Carlos. I need a clearer head to talk business." As Pedro spoke, he discreetly activated the continuous recording mode on his watch, in case Carlos tried anything. The tension was palpable. Carlos continued to observe him, like a predator assessing its prey. "Right, Marcelo, but know that, in this place, opportunities don't wait, and the inattentive can lose more than just a good deal." Carlos gave a smile that didn't reach his eyes and finally walked away, but his glances continued to follow Pedro until he exited. Pedro felt cold sweat trickle down his back. He had gotten the evidence, but narrowly avoided being discovered. Leaving the bar was a relief, but the feeling of having been marked, of having aroused suspicion, remained. He knew that from that moment on, the network would be on alert, and every move he made would be watched. In the taxi back, Pedro sent a mission-accomplished signal to the team. In the operations center, Almeida and Laura breathed a sigh of relief. "He did it," Almeida said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "We have the evidence. The harvest was recorded." "Yes, delegate," Laura replied, but her eyes were still fixed on the monitor, where the image of the bar, now empty of Pedro, seemed even darker. "But Carlos noticed him. He's in danger. From now on, the hunt begins." Almeida nodded, the satisfaction of victory mixed with apprehension. The first phase had been a success, but the game was far from over. The web of corruption had been touched, and now it would react. The humiliation he had suffered at the hands of the corrupt officer, the cold, constant fuel of his determination, now had a new dimension. He wasn't just unraveling a scheme, he was declaring war, and the war had barely begun. The taxi cut through the night city, but for Pedro, the world outside seemed distant, blurred. Cold sweat still trickled down his back, a vivid reminder of the tension that had enveloped him in the bar. He had succeeded. The harvest was recorded, irrefutable proof of the gears of corruption. But the price, he knew, would be high. Carlos, the lobbyist with predator's eyes, had noticed him. The mask of Marcelo Costa, until then impeccable, now had a crack. In the operations center, the atmosphere was one of contained relief, almost stifled by apprehension. Almeida and Laura reviewed the images and audio. Laura's voice, usually firm, trembled slightly as she played the crucial segment. 15,000 as agreed. The harvest was good this week. The boss sent word that he's satisfied, and that the South Zone project should be expedited. Almeida slammed the table, a dry sound that echoed in the room. "That's it. The South Zone project, the councilman, Ricardo Mendez. Everything connects. We have the evidence we needed to initiate arrests." But Laura didn't share the same enthusiasm. Her eyes were fixed on the image of Pedro walking away from Carlos. "Yes, delegate." But Carlos marked him. "He's one of the network's most astute watchdogs. He won't forget the Marcelo Costa, who was too close to the harvest." "He's a trained agent, Laura. He knows how to handle himself." Almeida tried to reassure her, but the concern in his own voice was evident. "He knows how to handle himself, but they know how to hunt. From now on, the network will be on alert. They'll look for anyone who doesn't fit in, anyone who saw too much," Laura insisted, her voice full of urgency. We need to pull him out immediately, or at least give him a contingency plan for what's to come. Meanwhile, at the bar, Carlos wasted no time. As soon as Pedro was out of sight, he approached Ricardo Mendez, his forced smile replaced by an alert expression. Ricardo, that fellow, Marcelo Costa. He was too close to the storage area. He asked about investment opportunities, but seemed more interested in observing. Ricardo Mendez, who had just exited the storage room after the transaction, frowned. Marcelo Costa? I don't recall seeing him before. Do you think he's a problem? I don't know, but my instincts say yes, he wasn't one of ours. And he didn't seem like a naive newcomer. There was something in his eyes, Carlos replied, his voice low and laden with malice. I'll make some calls. We'll see who this Marcelo Costa is. The gears of suspicion began to turn. Within minutes, the description of Marcelo Costa, man in a grey suit, practiced smile, alert eyes, was being relayed. The network, accustomed to operating in the shadows, felt the first tremor of a potential threat. Pedro, oblivious to the speed with which his disguise was being investigated, arrived at his safe apartment. The relief of being out of the bar was immense, but adrenaline still pulsed through his veins. He downloaded the data from the micro camera and audio recorder, sending them to the team. The evidence was there, clear and undeniable. He sat down, exhausted, but his mind racing. The humiliation he had suffered at the hands of the corrupt officer, the federal delegate, was the cold, constant fuel of his determination. Now, with this evidence in hand, he wasn't just unraveling a scheme, he was declaring war. And the war had barely begun. The next day, the city seemed the same. But for Pedro, the air was charged with a new tension. Almeida called an emergency meeting. The evidence is solid. We have the audio, the image of the briefcase, the mention of the boss, and the South Zone project. It's enough for a search and seizure warrant against Ricardo Mendez and the others directly involved in the harvest. But what about the boss, delegate? Pedro asked, his voice calm, but his eyes fixed on Almeida. Who is the real target here? Almeida sighed. Laura's intelligence points to the federal delegate. He's the highest link we've been able to identify so far. The boss mentioned in the audio is almost certainly him. Laura nodded. The way the aide spoke, the mention of the boss's satisfaction, and the order to expedite the South Zone project. Everything indicates he's the mastermind behind all of this. He uses Ricardo Mendez and the lobbyists as intermediaries. So, what do we do now? Pedro asked. We have proof of a transaction, but we need to link it directly to him. We need something that incriminates him without leaving any room for doubt. Almeida paused, his gaze thoughtful. The network must already be on alert. Carlos isn't one to miss a trick. Marcelo Costa must have already been investigated. We need to be quick and surgical. What if we use their own network against them? Pedro suggested, a dangerous idea beginning to form in his mind. They trust their communication channels. What if we could intercept something more direct, something that came from the boss himself? Laura looked at Pedro, a mixture of admiration and concern in her eyes. That would be extremely risky, Pedro. You would be the bait. What if they already know who you are? They don't know who I am, Laura. They know who Marcelo Costa is. And Marcelo Costa is a businessman who got too interested. If I disappear, they'll become even more suspicious. But if I reappear, perhaps with a new approach, I can try to get closer to the inner circle. Almeida pondered. It's a high-stakes gamble, but he's right. Disappearing now could be as dangerous as continuing. If they're looking for Marcelo Costa, we can use that. We can feed the network information that Marcelo Costa is a potential investor, but with a somewhat nebulous past, someone who could be useful, but who needs to be controlled. Exactly. Pedro agreed. "If they think they can control me, they might pull me closer. And that's where I'll get what we need. A direct communication, an order from the top." The decision was made. Pedro would not hide. He would expose himself, but in a calculated way, turning Carlos's suspicion into an opportunity. He would be the pawn, moving to the center of the board, luring the king into his trap. The hunt had begun, and Pedro was ready to be both prey and hunter. The next phase would be the most dangerous, a cat-and-mouse game where the line between success and annihilation was thin. He needed unquestionable proof, a video, an audio, something the federal delegate couldn't deny. And he knew exactly where to look. The federal delegate's own office. The city awoke to a new day, but for Pedro, the previous night still pulsed in his veins. The plan was laid out, risky, almost suicidal, but it was the only way to reach the top of the web. He would no longer be the Marcelo Costa who got too interested. He would be the Marcelo Costa who could be useful. In the operations center, Laura and Almeida reviewed the details. The bait would be cast. False information, carefully planted, began to circulate through the city's underground channels. Marcelo Costa, an investor with a complicated past, someone who had done questionable business abroad, but who now sought a new opportunity in the capital. Someone who knew too much about how things worked in the shadows, and who therefore could be both an asset and a risk to be managed. Carlos, the hawk-eyed lobbyist, was the first to bite the bait. His calls, previously focused on unmasking an intruder, now had a new tone. He had found nothing linking Marcelo Costa to any investigative agency, but the story of a nebulous past, of connections that could be useful, but which also made him vulnerable, was intriguing. Carlos saw an opportunity to turn the tables, to transform the perceived threat into a controllable pawn. "He's a lone wolf, delegate," Carlos reported to the federal delegate, his voice unctuous. "A man who knows how to move in the shadows, but who also has his weaknesses. Someone who could be persuaded to work for us, or if not, to be silenced discreetly." The federal delegate, a man of power and inflated ego, listened attentively. The idea of having a new asset under his control, someone who could do the dirty work without raising suspicion, was tempting. Furthermore, the mere possibility that Marcelo Costa had seen something at the bar made him a piece to be moved, closer or further away. "Bring him in. I want to see him, personally," the delegate ordered, his voice grave and authoritative. Pedro received the news with cold calm. The invitation had arrived. The wolf had fallen into the trap. The meeting was scheduled for the next day in the federal delegate's own office. Pedro's heart beat at a steady rhythm, but his mind was ablaze. He knew he was about to enter the lion's den. The next morning, the gray suit felt heavier, the tie tighter. Pedro looked at himself in the mirror. It wasn't Marcelo Costa who stared back, but the image of a man who had suffered, who had been humiliated, and who was now one step away from his revenge. The scar on his soul, left by the delegate's arrogance and contempt, was the fuel that propelled him. The federal police building commanded respect, a fortress of concrete and glass. But for Pedro, it was merely the stage for the final act. He was led through immaculate corridors, under the gaze of officers who seemed like robots, to the door of the federal delegate's office, a restricted room, a sanctuary of power and secrets. Carlos awaited him in the antechamber, a forced smile on his lips. "Marcelo, the delegate is waiting for you. He's eager to meet you." There was a veiled warning in Carlos's voice, a suggestion that Pedro should behave himself. Pedro merely nodded, his eyes fixed on the solid wooden door. Upon entering the room, the air seemed denser. The office was imposing, with a panoramic view of the city, bookshelves filled with books that had likely never been read, and a massive mahogany desk dominating the center. Behind it, the federal delegate, a corpulent man with a severe face and eyes that seemed to pierce the soul, sat, observing Pedro with an air of superiority. "So you're Marcelo Costa," the delegate said, his voice a low growl. He didn't stand up, didn't offer his hand. The humiliation began there, in the disdain of his gesture. "I hear you have a special talent for solving problems, and that you also have a past that makes you flexible." Pedro felt the heat rise to his face but maintained a neutral expression. "Delegate, I am a businessman, and like any good businessman, I know how to recognize an opportunity when I see one. And I know the value of discretion." The delegate let out a short, dry laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Discretion? You who were poking around where you shouldn't have been at Ricardo's bar. Don't make me laugh, Marcelo. You're an amateur who got involved in a professional's game, but perhaps an amateur who can be useful if you know your place." He gestured to the chair in front of his desk, an invitation that seemed more like an order to submit. Pedro, however, remained standing a few steps from the desk. The tension in the room was palpable, cut only by the sound of the air conditioning. "You know, Marcelo," the delegate continued, leaning back in his leather chair, an arrogant smile playing on his lips, "I don't like people like you. People who think they're smart, who try to infiltrate where they're not welcome. People who don't understand that, in this country, there are rules, and I'm the one who dictates them." He took a cigar from a polished wooden box, lighting it slowly, the smoke filling the space between them. "You're a black man, Marcelo, and frankly, I don't see how someone of your origin could have access to certain information or circles that you seem to have. It must have been luck, or perhaps you're just a pawn for someone bigger, aren't you?" Those words, laden with prejudice and contempt, hit Pedro like a punch to the gut. The humiliation he had suffered before from a corrupt officer resonated with overwhelming intensity. The delegate didn't know it, but he was lighting the fuse of a bomb. Pedro's blood ran cold, but his mind was clearer than ever. The calm he displayed was the calm of a predator about to strike. "I'm no one's pawn, delegate," Pedro replied, his voice low but firm. "And I don't need luck to know what's going on around here." The delegate laughed again, a laugh that mocked everything Pedro represented. "Oh, really? And what do you know, Marcelo? What kind of investment opportunity do you think you can offer me?" He took a puff from his cigar, slowly exhaling the smoke. "Or perhaps you're here to tell me what I already know, that you're a problem that needs to be solved." It was enough. That tone, that look, that humiliation. Pedro couldn't wait any longer. Adrenaline exploded in his veins. In a quick and unexpected move, he lunged forward. "I know exactly what you are, delegate," Pedro said, his voice now laden with contained fury. The delegate, caught by surprise, tried to react, but it was too late. Pedro pushed him forcefully backward, sending the swivel chair crashing into the wall. The cigar fell from the delegate's hand, rolling across the floor. Before the delegate could recover, Pedro sat in the leather chair, the same chair where the man had dictated his orders and humiliated so many others. The delegate, now standing, staggering, looked at Pedro with a mixture of shock and anger. "What do you think you're doing, you—" Pedro didn't let him finish. With a fluid motion, he pulled out his cell phone. The screen lit up, revealing a video. The video of the transaction at the bar, the briefcase, the money, Ricardo Mendez's voice, the mention of the boss and the South Zone project. All there, clear and undeniable. "I know what you are, delegate," Pedro repeated, his eyes fixed on the man before him, his voice cold as ice. "And I know what you've done. And now the whole world will know." The delegate's face paled, shock turning into panic. He tried to lunge forward, but Pedro was already a step ahead. With his free hand, he drew a pair of handcuffs from the inside pocket of his suit. The cold metal gleamed under the office light. "Federal delegate," Pedro said, his voice now laden with authority, the mask of Marcelo Costa finally falling. "You are under arrest." The delegate looked at the handcuffs, then at the video on the cell phone, and finally into Pedro's eyes. The contempt on his face had been replaced by icy terror. The hunt was over. The hunter had become the prey, and the humiliation, this time, was all his. The air in the room, previously heavy with arrogance, now became dense with panic. The delegate, a man accustomed to instilling fear, felt it corrode his insides. His features, once rigid and arrogant, collapsed into a mask of disbelief and terror. His eyes, which moments earlier had pierced Pedro's soul with contempt, now widened, fixed on the handcuffs and the video that replayed incessantly on the cell phone screen. The icy terror that had previously only grazed his skin now enveloped him completely. "No." What do you think you're doing?" he stammered, the voice that once roared orders, now a trembling, unrecognizable wisp. The image of his own downfall, projected on Pedro's cell phone screen, was a cruel mirror of his corruption. Pedro, still seated in the leather chair that belonged to the delegate, did not avert his gaze. His eyes, previously veiled by the persona of Marcelo Costa, now shone with cutting clarity. The flame of justice ignited. The calm he displayed was the calm of a predator who had patiently waited for the right moment to strike. "I am doing what should have been done a long time ago, delegate. I am arresting a criminal." His voice was low, but every word resonated with the unquestionable authority of one who held power in that moment. The humiliation he had suffered, the pain of being diminished for his color, everything transformed into a silent and unwavering force. The delegate tried to lunge forward, a last desperate surge of his old authority, but the space was limited, and shock paralyzed him. His mind, accustomed to manipulating and controlling, now spun in a whirlwind of denial and fear. Pedro stood up, the handcuffs in his hand seeming strangely light, yet laden with immense symbolic weight. The cold metal gleamed under the office light, a grim omen for the man who had always used them to oppress. "You can't cuff me! I'm a federal delegate! This is an affront!" The delegate's voice rose, hysterical, as he backed away until he hit the wall, cornered like an animal with no escape. Arrogance faded, giving way to desperate pleading. Pedro didn't respond with words, but with action. In a swift and precise movement, he grabbed the delegate's wrist. The resistance was weak, more a reflex of desperation than of real strength. The click of the first handcuff was a dry, final sound that sealed the man's fate. The second followed, chaining him to his own downfall. The delegate, now cuffed, looked at his wrists, then at Pedro, the brutal reality finally setting in. He was arrested, in his own office, by a man he had tried to humiliate moments earlier. The irony was palpable, bitter for the delegate, but sweet for Pedro. That man, who had used his position to trample others, to distill his prejudice and corruption, was now subdued. The scar on Pedro's soul, the one that propelled him, began to heal, not out of petty revenge, but from the feeling that the scales of justice, at last, were beginning to balance. Ignoring the delegate's grumbles and empty threats, Pedro picked up the landline phone from the desk. The device, once a symbol of power, would now be an instrument of his downfall. He dialed a number, keeping his gaze fixed on the delegate, who watched him with a mixture of hatred and panic. The office door, he knew, was programmed to automatically lock from the inside with a simple command on his discreet watch, ensuring no one could enter or exit without his permission. Carlos, the lobbyist, would be outside, oblivious to the earthquake that had just occurred. "Almeida, Laura, the bait bit. The fish is on the hook. Come to the federal delegate's office. We have a new prisoner." Pedro's voice was calm, professional, without a hint of hesitation. The mask of Marcelo Costa had been completely discarded. The mention of the names made the delegate pale even further. Almeida, Laura, agents of an intelligence unit he knew to be incorruptible, feared even by the most powerful. He wasn't dealing with an amateur investor, but with a high-level operation. The trap wasn't for Marcelo Costa, but for him. He was the prey, and Pedro, the black man he had despised, was the hunter. The web he had woven for others now enveloped him. Pedro hung up the phone and with a deliberate gesture sat down again in the delegate's leather chair. This time, it wasn't an act of momentary defiance, but the assumption of a new status. The chair, once a throne of corrupt power, was now the seat of justice. He picked up the cigar the delegate had dropped and extinguished it in the ashtray, a small symbolic act that marked the end of an era. The delegate, cuffed and humiliated, looked at Pedro, who now observed him with cold calm. The silence in the room was heavy, filled only by the distant sound of the city and the delegate's accelerated heartbeat. The panoramic view, once a symbol of his dominion, now seemed to mock his downfall. The tension had not disappeared. It had transformed. It was no longer the tension of imminent confrontation, but the tension of inevitability, of waiting for the consequences. The cat-and-mouse game had reached its end, and the hunter, who thought himself invincible, was now cornered, at the mercy of the one he had underestimated and humiliated. Justice, sometimes slow, sometimes painful, had finally arrived in the federal delegate's restricted office. The delegate let out a guttural sound, a mixture of rage and despair. His eyes, once full of contempt, now burned with impotent fury, but also with a deep fear he could no longer hide. He tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat, caught between denial and the brutal reality of his situation. The extinguished cigar in the ashtray, a small pile of cold ashes, was an epitaph for his arrogance. Pedro, seated in the leather chair, the same one the delegate had used to dictate destinies, merely observed him. There was no triumph in his gaze, only the seriousness of a completed task, the humiliation he had suffered, the words laden with prejudice, all of it now dissolved in the quietude of that moment. It was not revenge, but the restoration of order, the affirmation that no one was above the law, no matter their position or the color of their skin. Time seemed to stretch, each second an eternity for the delegate, who now felt naked, exposed. He tried to move, but the handcuffs restrained him, a constant reminder of his new condition. The room, once his sanctuary of power, had become his prison. He looked at the door, then at the window, searching for an exit, a hope, but there was none. The web he had woven for others now enveloped him without escape. You won't get away with this," the delegate finally managed to stammer, his voice hoarse, almost a whisper. "I have contacts, powerful people. This will come back to haunt you." Pedro tilted his head slightly, a gesture that could be interpreted as scorn, but was merely weariness. "Your contacts can't erase a video, delegate, and they can't erase the truth." His voice was calm, but laden with an authority the delegate would never expect from someone he had called a pawn. "And as for coming back to haunt me, I'm ready for it. I always have been." The mention of the video made the delegate shudder. The image of Ricardo Mendez, the briefcase, the money, the voice, all recorded, all undeniable. The irrefutable proof of his corruption. He had underestimated Pedro. The black man he thought was merely an annoyance, an easy target for his arrogance. He had mistaken Pedro's calm for weakness, his patience for submission. What a fatal error. Silence returned, even denser. The delegate, his body tense, began to sweat coldly. He could hear his own heart pounding in his chest, a drum of panic. The weight was excruciating. Every sound from the corridor seemed amplified, every shadow in the room, an omen. He knew that Almeida and Laura were not names to be ignored. They were the front line of relentless justice, and now he was in their path. Suddenly, a sound, distant at first, then closer. Footsteps, several, firm, coordinated. The delegate paled even further, if that were possible. His eyes widened, fixed on the door. The sound was unmistakable. The arrival. Pedro rose from the chair, the cell phone still in his hand, the video on loop, the irrefutable proof of his downfall. He stood beside the desk, an imposing figure, his erect posture contrasting with the delegate's shrunken form. The door, once a portal to his dominion, would now be the door to his disgrace. A soft click. The door unlocked. Almeida and Laura entered, their expression serious, professional. Almeida, tall and with an imposing presence, swept the room with his gaze, stopping at the cuffed delegate and Pedro. Laura, shorter, but with piercing eyes, did the same. There was no surprise on their faces, only the confirmation of an expectation. They knew what they would find. "Agent Pedro," Almeida said, his voice grave, a formal recognition that sealed Pedro's true identity. "Situation report." Pedro nodded, without averting his gaze from the delegate. "The federal delegate is arrested for corruption, money laundering, and abuse of authority. We have video evidence of an illicit transaction, as well as information about a larger scheme involving the South Zone project and other officials." He held up the cell phone, showing the screen to Almeida and Laura. The delegate tried one last card. "This is a setup. He coerced me. He invaded my office." Laura approached, her eyes fixed on the delegates. "Coerced you into accepting a briefcase full of money, delegate, or into uttering racist threats and insults?" She pointed to Pedro's cell phone. "It's all very clear here." Almeida gestured to the delegate. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you." He turned to Pedro. "Good work, Agent. We'll take him. The forensics team is already on its way to search the office. We'll need your detailed statement and the evidence." Two other agents, who were right behind Almeida and Laura, entered the room. They approached the delegate, who now seemed to have lost all strength. His shoulders slumped, and he lowered his head, defeated. The image of the imposing and arrogant man had completely dissolved. As the agents led him away, the delegate cast one last look at Pedro. There was no more anger, just an emptiness, the understanding that everything he had built, his life of power and privilege, had collapsed in an instant. The humiliation was complete. Pedro watched him leave, the door closing behind them. Silence returned to the room, but this time it was a different silence, a silence of peace, of justice. He remained there for a moment, the city view stretching out before him. That man had tried to diminish him, but Pedro had proven that true strength resided not in the color of one's skin or position, but in integrity and the relentless pursuit of truth. The scar on his soul, the one that propelled him, finally began to heal. The hunt was over. Justice had prevailed.